to other members of our community being hurt and injured for life in a violence that, you know, we know is deep rooted and situated in so many different situations. I also want to say today that Jamal, to our community, was not a gang member, was a human being, was a father of 2 kids, of 2 autistic kids that he was raising himself. And so the narrative has been put out there that he was, and he wasn't. He was outside his mother's home, just chopping it up with his friends, and the bullet hit him. So I really want to give my condolences to his mother and his family and their grief. Want to give condolences to Iran. A few of us went to their home yesterday and stood outside and listened to the neighbors and the community around there. And your home is your safest place. And my nephews and my young kids need to be playing at home and not worrying about the next second or bulletproof windows. So I want to say this to our community that, as Rose said, every life matters. And we as a community have the solution. It is not about, yes, we need the police to find out who did this. Yes, we need the police to do their job, but we also, as a community, do not need an increase of police to increase racial profiling, to increase Black and brown boys and girls being stopped on the street because of this. We need something else, and we've got to think outside the box. So I end with the fact is that Iran presente, Jamal presente.
Thank you, Commissioner Anand. Are there any other commissioners that would like to share any thoughts before we move forward? Commissioner Abernathy?
I just wanted to add, and just joining with what's as links, we've been praying for the families and the community and the police in all of this. So our prayers are continue to be lifted up, but especially for the families, for strength and comfort during this time.
Thank you. Commissioner Argento?
I just want to thank the commissioners who've spoken, Chairman Ibanez, who took the lead on this, and the other commissioners who spoke, because you know the people who are directly impacted, and it's different when you know the people well in your lives. So it's certainly, we all have sympathy. We can imagine what it'd be like to be in that situation. I've never been in that situation, but even imagining it, I don't know what it feels like. But I can imagine it's a horrendous feeling. And so I just, on behalf of myself, I'd like to express condolences in the way I've indicated.
Okay, we will now proceed to the next item, which are public comments on matters not on the agenda.
Thank you, Chair. We do have a few speakers who are interested in giving public comments. Who's the first one?
Jasmine.
Jasmine, if you're available, we will let you speak now. Okay, we'll start with Jasmine.
Hello. Thank you, Flo, for mentioning Jamal, for uplifting Jamal and Iran's life. That really means a lot to the community. We really appreciate that. And I thank you for letting people know that he's a father of 2 autistic children, and that he's a father first and a provider. That really means a lot. So for things that are not on the agenda, I just had a few things to talk about. We would like, these are a list of demands that we have and been having since 2016. We would like the officers to receive 1-year annual psychiatric evaluation. The oversight board should be the ones who choose and determines the psychiatrist, because a lot of these folks, man, there's a lot going on in our community, and we can tell that they do not like us, and that there's built up animosity, and we don't know where this animosity comes from. So we would really like if the board could pick the psychiatrist. We would also like the release of all footage for the murder of Reginald J.R. Thomas. His family still, and release the autopsy report for J.R. Thomas. That still hasn't been released. Also, we would like you guys to work in partnership with City Council to develop a reparations for victims of police brutality. We got this from Chicago. Chicago passed a policy like this in 2018 for all. It will provide financial assistance. It will also provide mental health. It will provide schooling for the victims' children, and it will also and what they do is they give this to the family until the children are 18 years old. So that really will mean a lot, you know what I mean? Because we know that when someone is killed, it doesn't just determine, it doesn't just affect them. It affects their children, their mother, their cousins, and also, hold on, my demands went on. It would, the other resources to those who have been brutalized by the police and to the families of all of those who have been killed in Pasadena. That should be a start. And this can be done. It's not something that's not achievable, man. If you guys just look at Chicago in 2018, they passed this. So that's really the demands that we have, that we've come up with so thus far. And thank you for your time.
Thank you, Jasmine. Next, we have Adriana. Adriana, you have 3 minutes to speak, starting now.
Hello. Last week, I reminded the commission that Brian MAXEY was chosen on the condition that the commission was actually satisfied with his services. And I just wanted to add a detail that I had forgotten, which was that OIR had originally been chosen as the independent auditor, and that this choice was halted by the Pasadena Police Officers Association, which was really fishy to a lot of folks. And so just want to remind the commissioners to please move forward with that in mind. I would also like to urge the new city manager, Cynthia Kurtz, to fire Officer Edwin Dumagwendon, Sereno, Duncan, and Rosa, and Mulroney. PPD has yet to release any video or information regarding recovery of a gun at the scene of Anthony McLean's murder. Black Lives Matter Pasadena has made repeated attempts through a public records request to gain information that would enlighten this part of the police narrative involving Anthony McLean's murder. And we have received some body camera footage and a very quick time lapse of the entire of the building surveillance nearby, but this part remains to be very shady.
Okay, thank you, Adriana. Do we have any other public comments?
No, not for subjects not on the agenda.
Okay. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Chair, with that, we can move to the next item on the agenda, although at your approval, I would suggest moving up item 8, which is the administrative updates, up to this point in the agenda so we could talk about that before we move forward with the meeting, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, that's okay. We will now proceed to agenda item 8, staff administrative updates.
Perfect, thank you. I want to give a bit of an update on a few items that came up at the last meeting. The first being the attendance at NACOLE. You remember, obviously, the commission asked for funding to attend NACOLE for members of the commission. And we are happy after conversations with the city manager and the city attorney, we were able to secure funding for 2 members to attend. We're thankful that Commissioner Anong is the one person who was actually able to go. We know it was short notice with the conference already being next week, right in the middle of the holidays. So we know it's a hard time. So we're very excited that Commissioner Anong will be attending on behalf of the city. As you know, IPA MAXEY will also be there. So we look forward to your attendance, Commissioner Anong, and hearing back probably next meeting, hopefully with a bit of an update about what you learned from the conference. Additionally, we talked about the chat functionality last meeting. And while we of course understand it's the commissioner's desire to use this chat feature as another communications tool, unfortunately, after discussing this with staff, you're unable to turn this feature on. While there are some Brown Act concerns which came up at the last meeting, one of the primary reasons that the city has been cautioned against using the chat feature is actually an accessibility issue. According to our ADA coordinator, if someone's using a screen reader, they'll be unable to hear what's happening in the meeting while they're also using the screen reader to hear what's happening in the chat. So for this reason and others, the city's policy has been to leave the chat feature off and allow for other ways of giving public comment. Of course, as you know, anyone who is not comfortable speaking verbally on an agenda item can always email cpoc@cityofpasadena.net before, during, or after a meeting. And all of that correspondence will be sent to commissioners and posted for the record.
Can I interrupt?
Sure.
Okay. Number one, in the ADA, I hear everything that the city has said, but I'm going to push back because somebody's got mute.
Go ahead, Commissioner. I think we're good now.
Okay, is that I hear everything, but in the ADA, that is not true. Because if you go back to the LA Oversight Commission, or even if you go to the Metro, which I'm on, Public Safety Advisory, all the chat features are open. The ADA has to be open, meaning that the city is going to have to provide on the screen, which is a little bit more work, which is that they have to provide, one, the Spanish interpretation. I mean, obviously that's already provided. They have to provide the sign language interpretation that goes in. And there's also the feature of if somebody wants to use the chat on their phone from the disability, which is already on their phones, that they can use it. This is not something that the city cannot do. I'd rather hear the city say that they don't want to do it, but this is Pasadena. We can't, if other cities are doing it, if Alhambra is doing it, if LA is doing it, then there's no reason for us not to be doing it. I would rather be able to hear that the fact of our transparency is that the only thing about the Brown Act is with the chat feature is that all of us commissioners who wish to use it have to press to send our messages to everybody. That is what overcomes the Brown Act. If I choose to send it to any commissioner in a chat room by just sending it to them, then that's wrong. But the chat feature has to be pressed to everybody. It is something that the city can do, and the legal team and the IT team can do. It's just a little bit of work that the city has never done. So I'm going to push back on that to rather hear why it's a no and the real no, because it's the transparency for our community. Some of our community members find it hard to be on this screen, and they're coming home from work or whatever, and our meetings are long, and they would just rather just chat in their whatever is their questions, and it becomes public knowledge. Why would we inconvenience the community always to write in a letter and then you send it to us? It doesn't take away from anything, and the fear of the city is that people may abuse it. But the point is, if you give it to people, they won't abuse it because they'll respect the fact of some of the people that are in that they're not going to do that. And it hasn't used on that, Ms. Fowler, and rather hear the real truth of, I'd rather hear Michelle Bonaris tell me that the city doesn't want to do it, but don't tell the community that it is not possible when it's been done in other cities.
Commissioner, I appreciate your sentiment. I truly do. And I understand the transparency issue. All I can speak to is the conversations I had with our own ADA coordinator. I think the issue is, you're completely right in terms of how we have to accommodate and how we will. If a person is not able to hear and is using a screen reader while they're looking at the chat, they cannot hear both at the same time. So that's the concern there. Again, I can't speak to what other cities are doing and how they've decided to act on that. All I can speak to is ours, but we hear your concerns, and I can, of course, always take that back and continue this conversation.
I do prefer for the ADA person who's saying no to be able to come and tell us in January the other cities of how they get around it and how Pasadena is saying no to it. I'd rather hear it from the ADA person than, than they say no to you if this is a real sticking point. Because for me, it is a sticking point, because in 2021, everybody is using the chat feature. All the cities are using the chat feature. And so for our ADA or our IT company to say that our community can't use the chat feature for something like this is like beyond me. But we can have a rose parade and put all the logistics together for a rose parade and have everybody around the country to come for one day, but we can't have a chat feature for a 3-hour meeting. I'd rather prefer to hear that. I'm sorry, I'm going to push back on that because I do think it's important for our community to have that space.
We also have Commissioner Kanaga with her hand raised.
Yes. Well, I join in pushing back because, first of all, I don't quite understand, well, there's two issues. One is the transparency, but I don't actually understand the ADA issue. I belong to a disabilities nonprofit. Virtually all of our programming on webinars, we have a sign language interpreter on screen. So I think it sounds like we may need a little bit more research on that issue, on the ADA issue, which, I mean, part of it is actually a legal issue, which is, what does this, what are the obligations with regards to the city to make these meetings accessible? Like I said, it's an easy, and it's done all the time, but there's a sign language on the screen. So, but the second issue is, and I'm not saying one is more important than the other, is what Commissioner Nag said with regards to transparency. So it sounds like more research is needed.
Thank you, Commissioner Kanaga. And I do not want to pretend to be an expert in this field. But from my understanding, what we're talking about is not someone who is hard of hearing. We're talking someone who is potentially blind, who would not be able to then see the chat. So they would therefore use a screen reader. And while they were using a screen reader, they would be able to hear what is happening in the actual meeting. So it kind of be two conversations happening at once is the issue at that point. But with that said, I know this is an issue that Commission cares about, and we can definitely take this back to the city people at B and see what we can continue having conversations about.
And I do believe that it's not about, and I'm going to push back because this is ridiculous to me. Like, I'm getting upset about the whole thing is that, a half truth is a whole lie to me. And I'm not giving it to you, Ms. Fowler, because you're only being told what you're being told. But whoever this ADA lady is or ADA person is, they need to step up front and be transparent and say it, because a disabled person, like I have, like in family members, they choose what they want to do on Zoom. So if they want to be in the chat, they'll be in the chat. If they want to just listen to the to the screen. They'll go to the screen, but everybody has an option. It's not one over the other for either or. It's having all parts are there for those who are disabled and those who are able-bodied to engage. So the ADA person can't come and tell me that, oh, we're blocking out the person who is blind or who think because they have their own devices to hear and they have their own devices to step into the chat. So I'm sorry, that person's gonna move me to some other kind of truth, because this truth sounds like a whole lie.
I think what we should do, if it's the commission's desire, is that we can either report back to the commission or bring somebody here that can address your questions. And I don't think there's that much of a problem doing that, so it can be explained from a legal.
Yeah, but my thing is, I don't want to waste another month of somebody to come here to explain to us, to tell us no. I'd rather hear the legalities of it during this month of saying, I want to hear from the city to say the legalities of it, why the city is legally saying no to the chat room, so it can be put out to the community on paper, on the website, that this is the legal reason why the city is saying no. I don't want to hear it I don't think it's fair, because we voted for this. And so automatically the city is saying that all these commissioners that voted last month, our vote means nothing to what we vote for, because you guys are going to oversee it in such a small thing. This is really small. So what does it look like if we're going down the road? So I'd rather hear to say that between now and January, that the city come up with the legal reason why there is no chat feature for this. And it's real petty. It sounds real petty, but it doesn't when you're dealing with people who've wanted this commission for years. And the community pushed for this commission. And it's up to me. I take my responsibility in the community real, right? That when there's violence and when there's this, that there's this place for 2 or 3 hours for the community to engage. Not everybody could be a commissioner. Not everybody could to do whatever. We're not going to be the place where people come on here and start cussing like they do at City Hall, because there's going to be some kind of respect, because we're fighting for something. So what I'm saying is, if our vote mattered and we voted unanimously, right? Well, no, maybe one against last month, then we should hear from the city why legally the chat feature can't, and prove it to us why it can't, and not wait another month to hear somebody from the ADA tell us this is the reason why, and it's full of, and then we move it to February, and maybe in the 3rd or 4th month, suddenly we have the chat feature because we pushed you all to the wall. No, let's have it legally on paper. What is the legal no for not having this chat feature in the Oversight Commission meetings?
Yes, I joined with that request, and to have it before, to have a memo, a legal memorandum before, in sufficient time before the next meeting, so we can analyze it, so we can look at it and review it, instead of just having to react to it on the spot. So that's the other thing, is I would like for us to receive the memorandum well before the next meeting.
Commissioner Matthews?
Commissioner Matthews, you're muted. Thank you.
Got it. I'm sorry. Point of clarification. I think it was mentioned that we voted unanimously, and except for one person. I think that one person was me, and I abstained from voting because I don't quite understand what the source is, what the chat is. And I'm glad it's come up again, because somebody can come and explain to me what it does and what it affords the person who needs it. So I just want to clarify that.
I'm sorry, did you call on me?
Yes.
Okay. Yes. We also have our own counsel. We can ask our own counsel I think we can ask our own counsel the same question of whether or not, under all of the public laws that apply to our situation, we can have or can't have the chat feature, which overwhelmingly we want to have. Now, there's an authority issue in that we're a recommending body. We can recommend to the staff, we can recommend to the city council about things, but we don't have decisiveness on certain issues. But I believe we can ask our own counsel for to look into the same issue and see what they tell us. So if there's interest in that, I would move that we do that in addition to whatever else is being proposed. To get our own counsel to give us an opinion.
I think that certainly there's going to be a number of issues raised. If you want a full-blown legal analysis about use of the chat function on Zoom meetings in 2021, that is within council's capabilities. There's other issues that involves, such as budget. And if that is the allocation of the budget that is deemed appropriate or wished, then we'll have to deal with that. Okay. And so there are going to be certain limitations in that area that I know that you all will be dealing with budgetary issues. I know that's been discussed with you all. So those are things that you're going to have to keep in mind. When it comes to the ADA, the chat function, to my knowledge, no other Pasadena committees or commissions are using that function. So someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but that is my understanding, is that no other committee or commission is using that function. And so this commission would then be the outlier. I'm just telling you what I know. I'm trying to just give it straight down the middle. Okay.
I think I respect what you're saying, right? I do respect what you're saying, but I also want to say that this is not no ordinary commission, and this wasn't started as a regular schmegular commission, right? And all the others are not regular schmegular commissions. They're all doing great work in our city, but this was started because losses of life. This was started because violence is being erupted and trying to be interrupted on both sides of the fence. So this commission is not about it's not regular. And so you wouldn't have so many people focusing on this commission that when we have our next critical incident, which I'm gonna keep saying it, right, is budgets go out the window, because somewhere along that line, that critical incident means a life has been lost. So maybe you want to talk about budgets, but maybe you want to talk about money lines. But if you really want to say that this chat feature is going to precede how much it costs to have this commission, then that's what you need to tell us so it can be made plain to the community. That's all that I'm saying. Everything that you're saying, make it plain so the community can see it, because it's not coming from us, it's coming from you guys. And if that's the case, then that's the case. But I'm going to go back to the beginning. Don't ask us to vote on stuff that you're going to come back and say, which you're saying now, by the way, that costs too much. So maybe we shouldn't
anything like no other commission operates in this way.
Okay, if there's no other comments on that, I don't think we need a formal motion. I think we heard what you're asking for, and we'll go back and create a written document and make sure it's distributed before the next meeting to make sure everyone is on the same page. We appreciate the feedback. I know this is something you're passionate about, and we want to be here and do whatever we can to be as transparent as possible. So I appreciate the conversation. I really do. With that said, a few other items before we get into the rest of the agenda. Informing commissioners of key police activity. This also came up at the last meeting. We are in the process of getting every one of you added to what the police department calls their noteworthies. We apologize. It's been a bit of a delay on the IT side of getting everyone added, but it should be done by early next week. And we'll keep you informed of when that happens. Those go out daily, if not more, with incidents that are happening in the community. So hopefully that will help solve that problem. And if you have questions, once you start getting them and seeing how they're laid out, we can happily answer that and kind of keep that conversation going to make sure you're getting the information that you feel you need to, serve this city well. And the last just administrative item is that we have the AB 1234 ethics training that has been brought up that it's been scheduled for December 9th. Every one of you should have received an email about that training with details. If you did not, please feel free to reach out to me and I will make sure you get the information you need for that training. So thank you, Chair. With that, we can go back to the regularly scheduled order, which would be moving to item 4.
Thank you. We will now proceed to the next agenda item, which is item number 4, approval of minutes from October 26, 2021 special meeting and November 4th, 2021 regular meeting.
Thank you, Chair. The draft minutes were included in your packets. If anyone has any questions or comments, we can do that. Or if someone would like to just move to approve those minutes for both meetings, we could do that as well.
So moved.
We have a second.
Second.
I heard a second by Commissioner Kanaga. I will do a roll call. Commissioner Abernathy?
Yes. Actually, it was not Commissioner Kanaga, but.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh.
I'm sorry. Whoever did the second, can you repeat who that was?
Commissioner Stacy.
Commissioner Stacy, thank you. Commissioner Abernathy?
Yes.
Commissioner Anong?
Yes.
Commissioner Argento?
Yes.
Commissioner Eric Ford?
Yes.
Commissioner Jones?
Yes.
Commissioner Kanaga?
Yes.
Commissioner Lurvy?
Yes.
Commissioner Matthews?
Yes.
Commissioner Stacy?
Yes.
Vice Chair Serrano?
Yes.
And Chair Ibanez?
Yes.
Thank you all. Minutes then for those 2 meetings have now been approved, and we could move on to item 5, which is a presentation from Independent Police Office Auditor Brian MAXEY on the review of previous independent reviews. We do have 2 public comments, but maybe we'll let Mr. MAXEY and then before we move into discussion, we will take those public comments.
Thank you all. Good evening, commissioners. Good evening, Pasadena. At the last CPOC meeting, I was tasked with reviewing prior officer-involved shooting and critical event reports to audit whether the Pasadena Police Department has complied with the recommendations contained in those reports. Just as a preface, the exercise that I engaged in since the last meeting was to read the relevant reports, to list out the recommendations, and do my best to audit whether or not there was compliance with each of the recommendations that were in the report. This really came down to, in most cases, sort of a binary distinction. Did they do this or did they not? There's more questions that we could certainly dig into about whether they did it well whether more could be done in certain areas. But I did my best to read what the recommendation was and determine whether the police department complied with that recommendation. I broke this down into 3 categories. There are ones that are completed, ones that are partially completed, and ones that are not completed. And in making those determinations, what I tried to look at really was whether the implementation of the recommendation accorded with the spirit of the recommendation that was being made. There are some that we're going to talk about tonight that are partial or even not completed that, maybe actually shouldn't be after the passage of time, as technology has been advanced, as other policies have been updated, as other laws have come to pass. But there are some that addressed the spirit and the issue of what the recommendation was trying to get at, but didn't necessarily meet the letter of the recommendation. And those I categorized as partial because I wanted to draw your attention to them, even though, if I were to offer an opinion on it, I would say it's probably sufficient. It does not meet the technical recommendation that was given. And so I wanted to bring it to you in as transparent a way as I could to show you what I believe is completed, what is not completed, and those that are sort of in that gray area in between. Up on the website, and I believe this was transmitted to you a little bit earlier today, is it's a PDF of a comprehensive spreadsheet where I did my best to lay out the reasoning. And what's important about that spreadsheet is in the last row of it, what I try to do is talk about the sources of how I came to the conclusion of whether this was or was not implemented. In that report, the OIR group did 2 of the 4 reports, and what was very helpful is as the OIR report, in the second OIR group report, they commented on the recommendations they made in the first report. And oftentimes they were able to say, yes, that was done. No, that was not done. So I was able to, they've done a much deeper dive into each one of these critical events than I have. So in many respects, they're the expert on what their recommendation meant and whether or not it was completed. But I did also do a sanity check on that as well to make sure that the policy did say what they alleged that it said. Am I able to share my screen? Let's see.
Yes, Brian, you should be able to if you want to give that a shot.
All right. Are you able to see the screen?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Okay. As I mentioned, the goal was to review these prior reports and find out whether or not they complied with the recommendation. There were 4 reports that met the criteria and were provided to me by the department. There was a 2009 OIR group review of the Leroy Barnes incident. There was a 2014 OIR group review of the Kendrick McDade incident. There was a 2016 National Police Foundation review of the Reginald Thomas Jr. incident, and a 2020 National Police Foundation review of the Pasadena Police Department use of force policy. They did a deep dive into the policy itself. The rest were incident-based reviews. So that is what I reviewed and attempted to look at the recommendations and figure out what had and had not been done. As you break out those 4, what you find is that there were 83 recommendations overall. Of those, there is a combination of which ones the department completed, partial, or not completed. As you can see from in the completed row on top, which is green, they've absolutely completed 54 of the 83. In terms of partial completion, they have done 20, and there are 9 that I determined were not completed within that set of 83. A lot could be said about the completed recommendations. And in fairness to the department, really, we should spend some time appreciating what they did do and some of the efforts they made. They have made presentations to the Public Safety Committee in prior years about what they were accepting and what they were not, and some of the reasoning behind that. And I looked at all those documents. As I said, I also reviewed the cross-referencing in the OIR group reports. I also talked with the department itself and went through this and asked them questions about their policies and protocols. Again, that helped my determination to figure out what was happening in practice. So while, as I said, in fairness, we should be spending a lot more time with completed recommendations, instead, I'm going to direct the commission and the public to the document that was put up on the website that really details that. And those are highlighted in green, and they run a wide gambit of.
Excuse me, Mr. Maxey, but people in the community can't see this. Is there a reason why they can't see it? We can see it, but some people are saying they can't. It's not being seen.
Oh, thank you for letting me know. I do not know why that is. Is anyone from the city able to help explain?
Brian, do you have it displayed on your screen? It was obviously posted on the website about an hour ago if anyone wants to, but do you have it to display on your screen, Brian? Right now we're seeing the requests for review page, not the detailed spreadsheet you have.
It is, Amanda, just so you know, I'm on the website right now, and it's actually not on the website. I know it's been emailed to commissioners, but it doesn't appear to have posted.
It should be listed, and I know sometimes there's a lag time, unfortunately. It should be in this where it says reviews and reports for like the supplemental information. Brian, is there a way you can, what you're doing now, and we'll make sure that gets published. And unfortunately, since it was just published an hour ago, there's a chance it's just kind of still uploading.
So I was able to access it on the website. I've downloaded it from there as well. Just to confirm, are members of the public unable to see the recommendations slide that I have that appears in my screen sharing? And at the same time, can commissioners see that?
I can say for myself, I can see what you're sharing, but because people are able to view this on Zoom, they're not able to see it for some reason.
Understood.
Which is weird, because whatever you show us, they should be able to see.
That would be my hope. Is there an IT reason that we're aware of why that's not happening?
I think that I can see the report on the internet. I pulled it off the internet, so I can view it. So it's actually on our commission website.
So he has to be sharing the PowerPoint, not the screen, I believe is what has to happen.
People are saying they can see it now, so somebody must have pressed a button.
And just to clarify, everyone, I think Brian is sharing a summary report on the website. We will, once this meeting is over, get this presentation from Brian and make sure that this summary presentation is also on the website. Is that correct, Brian, that this is a summary of that document?
Yes. Yeah, what I'm presenting here is an attempt to digest what is a 33-page detailed report on the intersection of those four reports and what was and was not accomplished. So, do we believe that we have the technology issue resolved and I should continue?
Yeah. And my apologies. I see it now posted under the reports and notices. Sorry about that, Amanda.
No, thank you. And that's a good point. We'll make sure we know where those things can be found.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, and thank you for drawing that to my attention. I certainly want the public to be able to see this. So basically what we're looking at that is the breakout of the different recommendations and what was completed and what was not completed. I do want to just say that there are some recommendations, and we'll talk about some of them tonight, that are very, very technical. And as such, partial compliance it's easy to fall into that category if you the absolute precise definition that's set forth, and some of the not completed ones, because I know the commissioners will be very interested in hearing what was not done. As you will see, some of them are actually organizational suggestions around policy that the department chose not to adopt, and it'll be up to the commission whether they're substantive or concerning in some way. So I am going to start working through the partially completed recommendations. I'm just going to start there. I'm not going to spend time on the green completed ones. So the first one is a recommendation that came out of both the Barnes report and the McDade report, recommending that the department have someone from training personnel respond to critical event scenes. Many departments do this. It's not always the common practice, though. There are questions about why they should be on scene during the investigation. And I think there's a lot of value to having trainers there. They know what they've trained people. Everyone can see policy, but with the nuances of training, you really need your training folks there to understand it. In McDade, in the McDade report, they did recognize that the policy does say that as part of the investigation, the administrative services lieutenant and training sergeant may respond to all officer-involved shootings, whether it is injury or death. I had conversations with the department about this. That, saying that it's a permissive, they may respond is not making it mandatory. It's not clarifying that they must be there. And in those conversations, I'm optimistic that the department will seriously consider making this mandatory, because they kept impressing upon me, this is their protocol. This is what they do. They do send out trainers. So just pointing out that it's not fully completed per the recommendation. And I'm going to pause after each one of these, because some of these are actually pretty complex issues that may be worthy of discussion on their own. And certainly I would welcome input from commissioners on this. So and Commissioner Abernathy, I see you just put your hand up. I'm going to seek some help from our city folks as well to just make sure that I don't miss people's hands, because I'm looking at multiple screens right now.
Okay, thank you so much. And thank you for this report. It's so helpful. I look forward to looking through all of it in more detail. But with this pause, you were noting that this is a thing that they intend to, this is part of their protocol, whatever they intend to do. Could we just have an update? Maybe it's as soon as next month, just confirming that. So now you're saying it's not quite there, it's almost there in terms of a lived out commitment, if I understood you correctly, but they aren't quite able to say that this is what we do in every case. Is that where we are at this moment?
So, there's often a divergence between what a department says it's going to do on paper and what it actually does in practice, because there are all those customs and protocols that don't always match policy. And the department is telling me their trainers are going out to these critical events. That is what they do. And I'm pointing out back to them that their policy is permissive and recommending that they make it not permissive, just so that anyone reading this policy will know what the absolute intent is. And in the next administration at PPD, they too will know what's expected, and it will not just be a custom.
Okay, so glad you're making that recommendation. Thank you for clarifying that. I did misunderstand. But do we need to, as a commission, I know we've got a lot to go through, so that would be something that we would want to underscore. I would want to be sure it happens. But do you feel by your saying that means the policy is going to change, or do we need to, make a recommendation? But I don't know where the other commissioners are with that. But
honestly, I think your first gut instinct was absolutely spot on. That we give this presentation here tonight. I continue to have conversations with the department, and I will report back out on changes that are made, or the department will do so, just so that we close the loop on what comes out of this.
Okay, that sounds good.
Okay. Moving on, there in the reports, there were 4 recommendations that I generally categorized as training recommendations. First of all, there's a recommendation the department require that a training bulletin be devised for every officer involved shooting that addresses the issues identified through the review process. The next recommendation was the department should brief the involved officers and issue a training bulletin on the tactical considerations and potential disadvantages in operating a patrol car while holding a firearm in one hand. So you see, we went from a very broad recommendation to a very incident-specific recommendation that was concerning to the reviewers. In the next recommendation, they are asking for a briefing to the officers and a training bulletin for all PPD officers, advising them of the department's foot pursuit policy and the tactical disadvantages of splitting up from a partner, the requirement that officers broadcast whether they believe the suspect is armed, and the tactical concerns in closing distance on a believed to be armed suspect. And then the last one was that PPD should brief the involved officer and issue a roll call briefing and or training bulletin regarding the need under stressful circumstances to remember to place your car in park before exiting the patrol car and the potential consequences if one forgets to do so. So you have 4 recommendations in this for training guidance back to the department. And the reason that I put these in partially completed is these are very specific recommendations asking that there be a training bulletin and an intervention with these individual officers on these very specific issues. And in regards to the overall practice of PPD, they report that they are using scenario-based training systems, and that is in the policing world, that is the gold standard, where you run through scenarios, you test things when there is no urgency and there is no risk to life, and you do your best to build in repetition so that you are more comfortable when you experience scenarios in real life. And the whole idea is to stress test yourself in safe environments in order to make sure that you can perform well in the real world. So they don't do the training bulletin. There are other things they do. They can do they have a chief's bulletin, chief directive, other instruction to the department, but the form differs from what was recommended. Regarding the holding the firearm in one hand while operating a patrol car, which is obviously a terrible practice, they say that was incorporated into the concepts in their emergency vehicle obstacle course training, but they did not issue a specific bulletin. Similarly, with the foot pursuit policy, they have one, and I will call that out, that most departments do not even have a foot pursuit policy. And it's good that they do have one. But PPD reports that the foot policy is trained in field training for new officers, is reinforced in scenario-based training. And in their response to the Public Safety Committee, when this report came out, they did indicate that they developed a foot pursuit training course. I have not reviewed that course. It was just reported out that they created such a thing. But again, they did not issue a training bulletin on that issue. Last is the training on putting a car in park. They do say that their emergency vehicle obstacle course training covers driving under stress, and that they believe that would be included in that. And, I realize this is a very, very narrow recommendation that you need to train officers to put their car in park. If they're not doing that, I'm not quite sure how you train them in that, other than remind them that, their vehicle safety is important in all circumstances. So I'll pause there for those issues. Commissioner Kanaga, I see your hand up.
So was the narrow question asked if the recommendation was for a training issuance of a training bulletin? Why was a training bulletin not issued?
Well, my understanding from PPD is that's not the way they train. Handing someone a piece of paper and saying, you need to do X, please read this and acknowledge that you have read this. It's not an adult-based learning technique that is as good as scenario-based training. However, for some of these things, like for example, put your car in park, you don't need scenario-based training to get at that. That's a pretty discrete thing that just needs to be, said to officers to the degree it needs to be said. The response from PPD, and certainly we can ask them to flesh this out, it's just they take the issues they identify out of their force review board and out of these reports, and they try to drive it back into scenario-based training. And that's what they are doing. I have not seen a tracking mechanism yet, if it exists, to ensure that those things are all completed and done. But that was the reason. That was the reason they gave to me, is that that's just not the form of their training, and they did do it in the way they normally train.
Okay, which goes back to the question, and I feel like I'm not alone. I may be alone in this question. The composition or the body or bodies that came up with these recommendations, are they inside the department or outside the department?
All of these are external groups. The OIR group is a California-based company that does a whole lot of detailed investigations into critical incidents, and they do it all over the country on a national basis, and they also do auditing work as well. Okay, so the phrase training bulletin may just be a term of art. And that is correct. Okay, so please stop basically saying we don't use that term of art, quote, training bulletin, but we're doing it, is what it sounds like you're saying. I think that's what I'm trying to communicate, yes, but it's also a form. A training bulletin in many departments is a piece of paper that is handed to a sergeant, typically at a roll call or a turnout, which they would then read to the officers prior to their shift. And it has some value, but it's not the same as going through training and being asked during that, as you're going through scenarios, as to what you would and would not do under those circumstances, and being, to physically do it. It's a much more passive form of learning. And what I'm hearing is that the department believes they are going deeper and doing this in real world scenarios. Again, what I can't confirm though, is that every single one of these made it into those scenario-based trainings. I have not seen a tracking mechanism to ensure that. Okay. So I feel like that's a liability question to the council who are on the call. In other words, these are recommendations. Training bulletin is a term of art. You're not able to confirm that, in fact, these recommendations were implemented to a T. No, I can't confirm that they were implemented to a T. I can, and this is what I've put in the report and the information here on the right column, is this is what I know that they did. And they tell me that these issues are built into their emergency vehicle obstacle course. They said they did a foot pursuit training course in response to this back in 2014, I would guess. But I've not seen those supporting documents to know what that training looked like and what it covered. And were they asked to provide that? No, I have not asked them to provide this yet. I had enough to do just looking at the reports themselves and the policies and what I could get at. So I have not asked for those follow-up documents. Okay. I have asked them about tracking mechanisms, because that's what I would actually expect to see. Because it's not efficient. I mean, I can certainly do it, but really the department needs to be tracking whether these were or not implemented. That would be my recommendation. Okay, because right now I feel like there are some loose ends, which are not, they're loose ends.
I don't want to interrupt your meeting. I hope I'm not overstepping my bounds here as being a participant, but our training is documented. And Brian, we can provide you with the documented training that we've done as you said, these are incident-based recommendations. They're based on a particular incident that occurred. So we did receive this report, and we did do much of the training that was recommended. But like you said, we don't use training bulletins. We don't just hand them the officers a training bulletin. We make it a part of their actual training or stress-based training. But we do keep a log of all the training that we put the officers through, and we can provide you with that.
Commissioner Lurvy?
Yeah, a question and a comment. And the question maybe is for council, but what is the expectation of compliance? You know, even the word recommendation is that it can be taken under advisement. And so is there truly a liability if every line item is not fully implemented? And the comment that follows from that is that, as Deputy Chief mentioned, these are incident recommendations. So these are the ways of preventing something that's already happened, but the next incident is likely to be different, at least in some of the facts and some of the areas. And so incident recommendations are not necessarily the best way to prevent future events. You'd want to do some amount of lumping together of themes. So a lot of the recommendations, for example, here have to do with protocols that should be put in place and training that should be done. And there's not a whole lot in there about systems that should be shifted or technologies that might be looked at or communication with the community that needs to happen. There are broad categories that all of these one-off recommendations might be grouped into so that you could better see whether or not we're making progress forward. It's very hard to judge progress by looking at 100 individual line item recommendations, whereas if you look at broad categories moving forward, and you can see if you're making progress on training overall or on communication overall. And so, Mr. Maxey, I know you may want to comment on this, but grouping this together into these broader categories so that you can track whether real progress is being made. I mean, that may be partly some of the work of this commission to try to understand where the best practices lie and what are our goals and objectives here, rather than just seeing whether each individual one-off recommendation has been implemented.
Thank you, Commissioner. I certainly have a lot of questions about how, for example, these training recommendations fit into an overall training program. What are the priorities? Is this at the same time that, fledgling concepts of de-escalation were starting to be trained at the department that took, priority far over whether any of these things in particular, as you triage the urgency of different trainings and what you're seeing systemically, not just based out of an incident. And, part of my work is going to be to read all of the use of force cases and develop themes and categories, I think very similar to what you're talking about, and seeing how the department is responding to those. This exercise that we're doing here really is a historical look into where we've come from 2019 based on 4 discrete reports of critical incidents. I do not purport to say this is a systemic review of the department in any way. This is simply, this really is auditing. In other words, looking at what was said and was it done, and how do you know whether or not it was done? And these are the ones that sort of fell into that maybe category of the department certainly responded to it. There was training that was done. Did it meet the letter of the recommendation? I don't know.
And the second part of the question was really for council, I think, of what liabilities accrue if each of the recommendations is not followed in its entirety. Like what exposure is that really to the city and the department?
Let me answer your question. Let me answer it like this. Broadly speaking, obviously, a city can be held liable if a jury or a court were to find that its policies were a violation of an individual's civil rights. Okay. Within there's a famous case called Monell, Monell, that discusses that. Within the context of that, and the claim that a particular city or department's policies could violate an individual's civil rights, a court could look at evidence from past incidents and past policy recommendations. That would most likely be up to the individual judge whether or not that evidence would be allowed.
Vice Chair Serrano.
Thank you, Chair. Brian, I'm curious about the use of these training bulletins, and I'm hearing that our department is, sort of boasting that they go above and beyond just a mere bulletin to communicate with its officers some training needs and practices. However, I just want to know from your perspective if providing these bulletins is a best practice in current policing.
I really think it depends on what you're training. I mean, I struggle with some of these. I mean, the certainly the one about putting the car in park, that would be something that you might read to officers at a roll call. I think they would laugh and not understand the context for it. And then without going back and actually training on that, it probably has very limited value. That being said, it's a very discrete concept. Watch your driving, be safe, all that. When you talk about having a training bulletin advising them about the foot pursuit policy, well, that really lends itself to a more a deeper training into that policy. You use that in an overall use of force training. You would have a module on training on the foot pursuit policy. Here are the risks if you separate, crossfire, going alone into a building. What if you catch up to a subject and you really need two officers there, and that somehow necessitates a greater use of force? There's all these things to think about, but it doesn't lend itself to jotting it down on a piece of paper. You can do, some departments use online trainings that are, short blocks of training time where they run you through a PowerPoint of certain concepts, and then you usually you're tested on the material to make sure that you've retained it, and you hadn't watched the training as well. So would I say that bulletins are a best practice? I think they can be useful. It's certainly not the go-to for adult learning in the modern era in policing.
Thank you. That's very helpful because it gives some perspective just to how fair and reasonable some of these recommendations are coming to us from OIR Group. The second question that I have, I see here in your notes the response to Public Safety Committee, and I'm assuming that means the PPD's response to these recommendations to the Public Safety Committee. I'm wondering, Brian, in your research, were you able to discover the ways in which the Public Safety Committee was holding the police department accountable to any of these recommendations?
No, all I got was the presentation packet that went, similar to what was put on the website for tonight's meeting. It was that packet that went to the public on the Public Safety Committee. And I received that and reviewed it because it was a good starting roadmap for the response.
Thank you, Brian. Nothing further, Chair.
Commissioner Abernathy?
You're
muted.
Sorry, thank you. So for what was noted earlier about the tracking and the questions about that, I do think, Brian, that you noted that you would, you do think that's something that the police department should be doing. And I think that would be helpful to have that, you know, to have to know what the tracking and what has happened. So I think it was noted by Deputy Moody that she said that there is evidence, Deputy Chief Moody, there is some evidence of a record of the training, et cetera. So that sounds like something more that they can produce as opposed to you to have devoting a lot of hours of obtaining. So I just think that would be helpful to know. The other thing, the comment I had, this car running issue of how you described it, but that I have a different perspective on that given having done a ride along. And to me, that is an example. It's not, yes, it's safe driving, but it's an example of the adrenaline rush that occurs. So we can witness that on a screen, but I experienced that in riding along, just the alert, the energy. And so I wonder, you know, if you take that as just, turn off your car. No, to me, it's a sign of the level of stress and, you know, anticipation, all of that occurs as one approaches a potential, you know, a situation. So first, do you see that in a broader way? I mean, I think it's more than just safe driving.
Yeah, you are correct. And that's why the department's response to the Public Safety Committee was that their emergency vehicle obstacle course specifically works on driving under stress. Because you're right, it's the stress and the adrenaline that, especially in unfamiliar circumstances, that lead to poor performance.
Right.
That being said, there's a lot that goes into police driving. You know, when you're going to accelerate, when you're going to brake, how hard you're going to turn, you know, what, you know, points on the car will pass. You know, there's a whole science to it. And I have never seen a training involving putting the car in park. I have seen pursuits that, you know, end in a car not being put in park, however, and rolling down the street and doing more damage than the pursuit did. So I'm not trying to say this is irrelevant. It's just, it was just a discrete issue that might lend itself better to a bulletin style rather than devoting part of an EVOC training to putting it in the park under stress. If you catch what I'm saying.
Right. So the way I'm reframing that, because that general statement doesn't get at this particular piece I'm talking about, and I know, you know, what adrenaline rush, you know, the most recent information about the effects of adrenaline rush. Because my view is threat perception impacted by that, judgment. I'm just saying human behavior, period. When the adrenaline, you know, you want to have precision, but there are all these other factors occurring. So I would be interested in current training, you know, the newest things that we understand about adrenaline, stress hormones, et cetera, and how that affects what behavior would be routine, like putting your car in park, right? Then that extends to other behaviors. That's part of what I'm asking about. You know, it's a particular kind of stress, in other words.
Yes, and I can certainly get you more information on that because there's a lot of things that address that. You know, there's a lot of studies into the prolonged effects of cortisol on officer brains and how that leads to performance reduction. There's also, I mean, that's where the concept of de-escalation comes in, about slowing down an incident. Don't rush in, don't engage, try to get past that impulsivity that a lot of the chemicals that are in your body are driving you towards. It's also where departmental policies on officer intervention, where you intercede. I think this department calls it the duty to intercede, but intercede into the action of your fellow officer who may be acting under and making poor judgment or decision making based upon adrenal overload or fright or whatever the emotional aspect is. So there's a lot that tries to target that writ large. So it's incredibly important stuff you're bringing up, Commissioner.
Okay. Thank you.
Commissioner Anong?
I think my question to you, Mr. Maxey, is that, and maybe because I've seen this reports and the recommendations so many times, but I think what I'm hearing from you is saying that you're seeing these recommendations and you're being looking at, or as far as you can see, this is about what they've done, or as far, as far as you can see, and you're saying there's a third part of this review that you wasn't able to get to because, and that is, what have they actually done? Am I wrong? Am I right?
I'm an attorney by trade, Commissioner. I'm gonna have to say neither. It's somewhere in the middle there. I didn't ask for the underlying trainings to validate and connect the dots, because if I understand what the deputy chief said here tonight is they have records of the trainings they have given. What I did not hear, and I do not believe exists, is connecting the dots between these recommendations and the trainings that were given. And I can certainly go do that step, but that is going to require looking at each recommendation, going through trainings that were given, in the emergency vehicle obstacle course context, perhaps, looking at the curricula that were developed for that training and see which of these recommendations were addressed in there. So that is the next exercise I could do. I did not do that before tonight. That's a much deeper dive into this, and I wanted to bring this to this group to see, some of the issues we're going to talk about tonight, I think are going to lead to more action than perhaps this particular one does. I mean, this to me says you need a slightly better tracking mechanism to ensure you are complying with these recommendations. Some of the ones we're going to get to a little bit later really have some substantive implications.
Okay, so my part two of my question is that and I think Commissioner Abernathy said that there is going to be sections in these recommendations that take a deeper dive, that instead of putting it all on you, could be moved to more of an ad hoc committee to do it among a group, to learn in that group, to go into that deeper dive and still have you assist, but it could be like that, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, so that's where I'm going to, is that I feel that for us to be able to get into the weeds, and even some of the stuff that Commissioner Abernathy was saying, that it would be almost impossible to do it in this space, but it would be more time feasible to do it in smaller committees and then report back on these recommendations and timelines and trainings and what we're discovering. I mean, do you see that as a plus or do you see it as a minus? I'm putting that out there because I see it that there's some of these things do need a deeper dive, but I don't see it always being fully effective being in this space.
Oh, I think taking some of the more substantive issues that this body wants to grapple with and moving it into a committee to do that deeper dive, to educate yourselves, to ask the hard probing questions within that context, I think that's a fantastic idea.
Thank you.
All right, I'm going to move on to the next slide, seeing no more hands. If I can manage it. So this was a recommendation that came out of the McDade report from OIR group, and what They made similar recommendations coming out of the Barnes review, and what they were really looking for was an interviewing technique that really dug into inconsistencies in the officer's version of events. And it says the Pasadena PD should design investigative protocols that would ensure that witnesses were questioned about observations that could do so. And in talking with PPD, they send their investigators to I think both LAPD and post trainings for investigative techniques, including cognitive interviewing. So they are training their investigators in this area, which was part of this recommendation. But the second part was to design investigative protocols that would ensure that witnesses were questioned. They have policies that discuss how officer-involved shootings or other critical events are going to be investigated. They talk about canvassing, they talk about interviewing, they talk about getting the CSI groups out to do the more detailed analytic forensic analysis. They have all of these things done, and it's done in broad brushstrokes of these are the categories of areas we need to dig deeper into. This recommendation flagged for me the possible need for a more detailed investigations manual for officer-involved shootings and critical events. There are many departments that really lay out, these are the steps that we will investigate to get to the truth of these events. And this is not to say that this is not happening in these investigations. This is to say that there is an aspect to transparency, to consistency, to ensuring that there is the comprehensive nature of investigations really gets all the information and analyzes it properly. And these investigative manuals that I've seen in other departments, they can get extremely granular, starting out with who's going to do this, checking for conflicts of interest between the officers and the officers that are the subject of the investigation. And just laying this out, if there is a conflict, you will do X in order to resolve it one way or the other. And if it's not resolvable, you recuse yourself, then the next person comes in. And because you have this checklist and these protocols on how to move forward, you get to that consistency. And I think that's really what this is asking for. And I have, I talked with PPD about this, and I have offered, and they said, please do, to send them some of these examples of investigative manuals for their consideration. Commissioner Abernathy.
Yes, this is really critical. Critical for gathering the accurate information, right? About what has occurred. I'm just checking in with you, Mr. Maxey.
Yes.
Okay.
So they do have policies and protocols around this. They do. I'm just saying that I think there is an opportunity to get even more granular onto that and make sure that all the details are covered.
Okay, so that's another example that it'd be great to have an update on, next meeting where the status is with that. And when I think about these updates, the spirit of it is, okay, we'll hear whether progress is being made, and then if progress is not being made, we may need to take a particular action. But as long as progress is being made toward this end, then. But that's what we would want to keep abreast of.
So again, for me, if I may, we do have policies and procedures and investigative manuals for both, because officer-involved shootings are bifurcated. You have your criminal investigation, and then you have your administrative. Each separate section has their own manual pertaining to their particular investigation, and we can get those to you, Mr. Maxey. And if you provide them to the commission and they like to see changes, then we take a look at that. But I'd like for you to look at first what we have, and it may suffice.
Happy to do so.
Vice Chair Serrano.
Thank you, Chair. Brian, I'm just hoping you can just quickly get us all on the same page about POST, what POST offers a police department like Pasadena, and how we utilize them as a resource.
So I would actually need to do a little more research on the relationship between Pasadena and POST and how they are using POST, unless the deputy chief wants to address that. But generally what's happening is the police officer standard and training is developing curricula, training courses, and offering them out to departments to help ensure consistency across departments in California and ensure that they're up to the same standards. Chief?
Yeah, the California Post or Police Officer or Peace Officer Standards and Training, they certify departments and they certify particular officers that they have met the standard for California as far as training and protocols related to policing for the state. So there are certain standards, there are certain hours of training that each officer has to go through per year, every year, recertification, in order for the department to remain certified through the state. So we rely heavily on a lot of the training that they provide. Well, we do adhere to their training in order for us to stay current as far as the state mandates are concerned. But we also offer additional training that is not so often post-related, but it's instruction that we feel like the officers need. For instance, wellness training. We do provide wellness training. It's not necessarily a post-mandate at this point. Putting your car in park, I mean, that's not necessarily a post-standard, but it's something that we do teach our officers. But yes, as far as post, it's a state mandate that each department, from what I understand, in the state of California adheres to.
Seeing no more hands up, I will move forward. Okay, here there were some tactical recommendations that the department certainly has a response to it and has trained on, but there were just slight differences that they may well have met the spirit of these recommendations, but I just wanted to draw the very narrow, they did not meet the letter of the recommendation. And here, the first one is a recommendation that PPD should circumscribe its tactical policies and create training that would prohibit a cutoff and box-in maneuver whenever pursuing suspects believed to be armed. And the context of this is if you're cutting them off and boxing them in and they're armed, then they will be shooting at you, and that could lead to officer-involved shooting or officers getting hurt themselves. The department's policy, and I put the whole thing in here. First of all, in order to use the boxing technique or the cutoff technique, they need to get supervisor approval to do it during the pursuit. So they need to request that, say they're going to do it, and ask for a supervisor to authorize it. It needs to be coordinated, which that's part of the radio traffic, and then needs to take into consideration the circumstances and conditions presented at the time, as well as the potential risk of injury to officers, the public, and occupants of the pursued vehicle. So right there, that's saying that you must consider, the risks of what you're doing, the reward benefit of using this maneuver at that time. In my mind, that certainly addresses the spirit of what the recommendation was, but it is not an absolute prohibition on using this maneuver when pursuing armed subjects. So that's why I brought it to your attention. The second one here, since this report, the department has adopted body-worn cameras that have quite extensive rules on when they are being turned on and the most basic level, they're required to be activated in response to all calls. However, they don't have mandatory policy for their dash cams or in-car video systems, and those are activated by the lights and sirens. So while the reason I draw that distinction is at showing up on a scene now, the body-worn camera needs to be on, but there is not a reciprocal policy for the dash cams. And I know that the department is working on upgrading their dash cams, so it's probably a ripe time to think about their policies and what they want to do with the new ones. The other thing is, if they are using the same manufacturer as they have for body cameras and dash cams, the systems can link. So you activate one and they both go. So there's certainly some opportunities for, what happens during this technological upgrade. And I will pause there. And moving to the next one. There were a lot of recommendations about review process, how the department analyzes and considers the results of its own investigation and what it does with it. And several of these recommendations really circle around a critical incident review action plan. The first one says that it needs a documented, tailored, detailed action plan designed to target and address any issues involving tactics, supervision, training, equipment, etc. And they recommend, the OIR group recommended this in Barnes, and they noted that their recommendation in Barnes, while the department asserts that it followed our recommendation here, for the reasons detailed above, we do not believe they completely satisfied that recommendation. This recommendation for the critical incident review action plan, it talks about identifying all the tactics that whatever lessons learned go back out once again in a training bulletin, that whatever decisions are made to come out of this should be put into assignments of tasks out to PPD and include a report back date when the review board should reconvene and receive feedback about the efficacy of the actions ordered. And then on the back end, there's also a transparency component saying whatever you do and whatever you're putting out there, you need to be publicly facing about this, release the factual, analytic, public information so that the public can understand what happened and how the department handled the investigation and review of that. There's a whole lot in here. So in the Force Review Board at PPD, which is comprised of command staff, there are discussions about, and the policies do talk about the tactics, the supervision, training, equipment. So they're going through that checklist, and because it is comprised of command staff, certainly the command staff divvies up the responsibilities to move forward with whatever recommendations that come out that they're going to do. But again, I have not seen a formal tracking mechanism. I'm not saying there is not a record that these decisions were made and these people were assigned to do it, but I don't understand that it is in one place. And that makes it a little more difficult to track. Additionally, when you look at the authorizing release of factual, analytic, public information, there is a policy that governs that talks about who can give out information, who's not going to give out information, how to handle release of information. I also put a link to one of the more recent events and the information that was put out. I think there has been a move towards greater transparency, certainly looking, from the Barnes time period into our current time period. And the example I gave here is McLean. There certainly is a lot more information being provided to date. That being said, I think if you look at this recommendation, they're asking for a lot to be made public. It is the administrative review, the response to it, what actions were taken, and how do you confirm that those actions were taken? So a lot of the conversations we've been having here tonight about transparency on the follow-up to ensure these things actually got done. I will pause there. Okay. Okay. This one will undoubtedly open up a little bit of a can of worms here. The recommendation was to interview the involved officers no more than a few hours after the incident. And as the deputy chief said earlier this evening, there are two reviews that are going on. There is a criminal investigation because this is, if this is a in custody death or a officer involved shooting that leads to a fatality, it is a homicide and it is investigated as such. There's also an administrative investigation that occurs. Typically, it seems PPD is waiting until after the criminal investigation is completed and there's a decision on that before commencing the administrative. And in many ways, there's some efficiencies to that because they can rely on a lot of the investigation work that occurred and you're not duplicating efforts. But it does lead to a long delay in time. And we look at different issues about liability. And, if you have an officer subjected to multiple interviews over time, they're consistent. The consistency of their statements may change over time. They'll have different inputs. They'll be in a different mood. They'll have slightly different questions, and it can really create complexity in actually getting to the truth. That being said, I think there's a really significant issue in reputational liability, where departments that are not able to get to quick, coherent resolution to critical events leaves the public wanting and leaves them in a state of agitation, even trauma, as they wait for the results. And the prosecutor's office and VAs are not always very fast at getting through their determination on whether a criminal investigation should lead to charges or not. And so you have this long period of time. So I look back at this recommendation that says you should talk to an officer conducted no more than a few hours after the incident. And honestly, in this country, this issue is all over the map. There are some that will not interview an officer for 48 hours as an absolute rule. There are departments that will not let an officer go home until they are interviewed, and if they are unable to continue with the interview, will sequester them and not allow them to talk to anyone, which, except for one hopes, family, their attorney, and their union rep. So there's a balance to be struck here, but practically, if the department is not conducting administrative interviews until after the criminal investigation is done, it's not possible that you're going to be talking to an officer no more than a few hours after the incident. You can ask an officer to give a voluntary statement a few hours afterwards, but it is 100% in their control at that point, because you are not compelling them, because they've got their Fifth Amendment rights and they do not have to talk to you. So while I tend to agree that best practice in this area, and again, there's a lot of different perspectives on this, I tend to land on the side of doing it as quickly as possible, while having some semblance of humanity for what you're putting your officer through. So if they are actually traumatized, you need to give them some space, but you should do it as soon as they're capable of doing this. But again, if you're proceeding with criminal first, then that's a voluntary interview and cannot be compelled. So I go around in circles on this, and it really comes down to the question of should PPD be doing concurrent criminal and administrative investigations. And that's sort of the core, a core question. And again, many jurisdictions choose to handle that differently for a wide variety of reasons. I'll pause for questions or comments. I saw Commissioner Kanaga first. And you're on mute, Commissioner.
On the question of whether or not to conduct concurrent criminal and administrative, that triggers a host of legal issues, right?
Yes.
And based on state law, where do you come down in terms of recommendations?
So to dig really deeply into this issue, I'm going to need to do a little bit more research, California specific.
Right.
Usually what happens is the choice not to conduct an administrative investigation usually lies with the department. It's not under law. There are some district attorneys and prosecutors that will, try to coerce a department to not doing a administrative investigation. But practically, the way most departments that choose to do concurrent investigations have resolved the legal complexities is you have a criminal investigation that's moving forward. You then have a special master that controls the one-way flow of information from criminal into the administrative arena. Then you have an administrative investigation that's going forward that is completely walled off from the criminal investigation, except for information that comes through that one conduit. Then the administrative investigation, they can compel the officer to give a statement. What they can't do is have that statement go back to the criminal investigation in any way, or any information that comes from what the officer said go back to the criminal investigation. So you take pretty extraordinary steps to segregate these two investigations and make sure there's only a one-way flow of information. But it's not insurmountable, and many departments do it. Did that answer your question, Commissioner?
It is an important question, but I understand, I do know it is very complex from a legal standpoint. And I'm sure that the department has already looked at this question.
Well, yes, and the department's policy is, although this interview should not be unreasonably delayed, care should be taken to ensure that the officer's physical and psychological needs have been addressed before commencing the interview. And based on my research and understanding, that is actually a very appropriate statement as to when that interview should happen. I might add, instead of unreasonably delayed, that it would be done at the earliest possible time, with that same caveats about the officer's physical and psychological needs. But again, none of that matters when the criminal is done before the administrative, because you just don't get to that yet.
Well, the point I was trying to make is that I'm sure that PPD has already looked on the merits and the downsides to doing a concurrent criminal administrative interview, because that first sentence is not, it's not on point. So that might be something that as a commission, we want to look at further in subcommittee. That's my point.
Commissioner Anand.
Hey, I think she just nailed it, really. But I want to ask a question, and to me, I'm a person that I'm going to ask. To me, it's an idiot question because I just don't get it. Is that you said in the beginning that that there's kind of like the way that we're doing it right now is that there's an incident, there's a critical incident, an officer involved shooting, and everything gets set aside. Everything gets set aside until after the criminal investigation is over, right? And after is that what you're saying? When the criminal investigation is over, that's when it kicks in to PPD then dealing with the officer in their investigation. Is that what you're saying?
I see Deputy Chief Moody jump back on the screen, but I'll say it's my understanding that yes, that's the way it's happened, that right now the administrative is deferring to the criminal investigation and waiting until it's over.
Okay.
And I'd just like to bring up a critical point with that. One of the reasons we look at doing it that way is the administrative side of the House is only looking at policy violations, procedure violations, as far as the officer involved in an officer involved shooting. The criminal aspect, which the department does from the detective side, they're looking at unlawful conduct. The administrative, and also the DA's office does a criminal investigation. So there's a two-pronged approach to the criminal side. Keep in mind the administrative side of the House gets the statements from the officers from the criminal side. On the administrative side, criminal can't get the compelled statements. So we can get, before rushing into an administrative investigation, we try to wait until everything's done on the criminal side and we can get all the statements from the officers. We're entitled to all those statements. So that's another reason, I suspect that we wait.
Thank you. So let me go back to what you were saying, was that at the moment, the pattern or the methodology for Pasadena is the incident happens, the criminal case goes through, does its process, and at the end of the process of the criminal case, then the officer administration then kicks in, and then it comes in and has their outcome.
That's correct. Then we look at the policies to see if there are any policy or procedure violations.
Okay. So my thing is that, so if we go, and Mr. Maxey or whatever, tell me if I'm wrong. So if I go to like Kendrick McDade, do you know offhand how long it took from the criminal investigation to the outcome of the officer administration? How long did it take from McDade to the officer administration? And how long did it take from J.R. Thomas from the criminal investigation to be over to the officer? Because I think that the elephant in the room for everybody is that there's an understanding that the police officer has to be protected. I get that. Everything that happened, I get that. Something went wrong, had to let off his gun. It is what it is. And so all the mechanisms of the police bill of rights, clunk click around the police officer. But I think that if you could say, Mr. Maxey, is how long, like, is it, if Kendrick McDade was 2 years, and then there was administrative review. If J.R. Thompson was 1 year and then the administrative, I think that's kind of what I would like to hear, and probably the community would like to hear, because that shows the pattern of, even if it never changes, even if PPD say this is the way we're going to do it, in everybody's mind knows that from a critical incident, we now know that it doesn't matter what we say or what we do, is we're never going to hear the outcome of the police officer until 2 years or there's an average of 2.5, 3 years before the administrative results come out. Because you said something then that if I don't really have to get interviewed, if there's a police officer and he has a critical incident in 2015 and they don't come up to their administrative review, and that's 2 or 3 years later, they've been on the force, they've been in the community, they've been moving, whatever it is, no, anything that happens to them, how is their story 2 or 3 years later going to be just as impactful as it happened when it happened? That's just something that is, to me, the elephant in the room. And it's something that the other commissioner said, that we can unpack that in subcommittees, because I personally don't think it's the job of you to come back, to go look for that and come back and tell us. I think now we have to find the holes that we need to now dig for ourselves and learn and come back to report back to the committee. But does that make sense, Mr. Maxey?
Everything you just said makes perfect sense to me, Commissioner.
So am I right? Like, is there a way to say that that there's a lot of years before the other one happened, before the domino effect happens? So if we could possibly go find out if there's a pattern, right?
Yes, Commissioner, I can get you those timelines as to, incident date, the end of the criminal, the decision either to charge or not charge, which is really sort of that decision point, how long the administrative investigation took, when the and when the decision of the department came out on that. I can get you those timelines for these 3 critical events. That shouldn't be difficult.
I think that would be healthy. Thank you.
Okay. So now we'll move into the
Brian, I'm sorry to interrupt. I had a question, and I also see that Commissioner Abernathy has a question also. But I apologize, I wasn't tracking. I'm not sure if I'm actually next.
You are.
Okay. Okay, thank you. So my question is to be directed to Deputy Chief Moody, if she's still available. Thank you. So I want to go back to a comment you made earlier regarding the statements by officers in officer-involved shootings, that the department is able to access the statements that were provided for the criminal investigation. Did I understand that correctly? Sorry, you're muted.
Okay, yeah, that's correct.
Okay, so where I have some curiosities around whether or not, when it becomes time for the department to engage in its administrative review, are they compelling a statement from the officers once again, or are they only using the statements that were utilized in the criminal investigation?
It just depends. If administratively we need to ask more questions because there were not those policy questions asked during the criminal investigation, then yes, we can compel them to answer those questions administratively. But again, we can get their responses to questions criminally. And I'd also like to add that the criminal investigations done by our department involving an OIS is usually done within 3 to 4 weeks. We're complete. And it goes to the DA's office, and many times that's where it rests. That's, they're bombarded. I could just add that. They cover the entire county for officer-involved shootings, and a lot of times that's the backlog, that's the delay. But we're done within 3 or 4 weeks of our criminal investigations.
Okay, so just to clarify, there's criminal investigations, administrative investigations. In the criminal part, there's a component that the department is responsible for, yes, and then it hands it over to the DA's office.
That's correct. And they conduct their own criminal investigation.
Got it. And then those statements that the department is able to acquire from officers involved in OISs that were passed on to the DA's office can then be circled back to at the time of the administrative review, and additional statements can be acquired from officers at that point in time.
That's correct. They will be compelled statements.
Okay. Thank you very much for that clarification.
Commissioner Abernathy?
Yes, thank you, Chair Banez, and thank you, Vice Chair Serrano. When Commissioner Anand had spoken about some of this process and the timing and all of that, and that's the challenge, right? We know criminal investigations take forever, just in general for all these different reasons, but that's the challenge that, years later, people are waiting for these things. So I just wonder, I'm wondering about, can any portion, and I'm not saying some things or minimal things aren't shared, but I do wonder about that. Can anything more be shared in the interim that, so the community could have more knowledge and understanding? And then what I specifically wonder about, Mr. Maxey, is what are and you may know this off the top of your head, but what are the standard timeframes between like major incidents like this, criminal proceedings? I know everything, it varies, but you know what I'm saying? I wonder where we are compared to, other states or cities. Are we an outlier? Are we kind of in the general range or shorter? But what we know, it just feels like the communication, there's just this, vacuum, the gap is too wide. So any thoughts about that?
Yeah, you raised two issues. You raised the transparency issue. You also raised the timeline of the investigations issue. I don't think that Pasadena is an outlier. Many departments do the criminal investigation, wait on it, and it is, as the chief said, often delayed at the prosecutor's office because they're, both very detailed, very complex cases. They're also very political cases, both. No matter where you land on it politically, it's very political. So, you find prosecutors that really take their time and think about when they're going to do things. And but I don't think Pasadena is an anomaly nationally. I think there are some places that take, a lot longer, and often again because of prosecutorial delay. You also have departments that are doing it much faster. Seattle does all of them within 6 months, but honestly, it's because the process there is they only run a criminal if they see the need to. And I don't think that's good practice. I think they should be running a criminal as well, because once you start an administrative and then decide you're going to run a criminal, everybody's going to say, well, what made you think that? Perhaps it was something that you learned from the officer's statement. There's definitely questions to look into with that, but 6 months I think is the shortest I've ever heard in a critical event between getting to resolution. There are also departments that take action prior to running an administrative investigation. If it is so clear from the early information that disciplinary action needs to be taken against the officer, many just move forward with it without the investigation, and they'll see whether they need to do that formal investigation. So there's a whole wide range of possibilities on that. On the transparency issue, California is governed by the 45-day release of body-worn cameras now, which is not, it's not fast. It's certainly not slow. There are many that say, you can't release it until after the criminal investigation is completed, and therefore you're waiting years on it. Again, Seattle does it within 48 hours. They put out critical information, facts, and video evidence almost immediately. And that often helps to give communities something to look at, to think about, to have some glimpse into what's happening. There are also a lot of departments that issue statements explaining what happened. And that's a very risky practice because it's often defense postured, or it is, all those pitfalls in trying to be transparent where departments make errors, like releasing the criminal history of the person affected. There's no reason to do that. The only reason a criminal charge should be mentioned in the context of a use of force is if it was what caused the use of force or was necessary to it. So, for example, if you knew someone was a convicted felon and they were wearing a firearm, maybe you would know that, that person cannot possess that and that's unlawful possession, and that might have initiated the contact. So then you would want to connect those dots. But other than that, it's irrelevant. It's tempting, the press will figure it out, but there's no reason for a department to put it out. So what I generally recommend is a department have very clear, consistent policies about what it is they're going to do and when they're going to put it out and what their considerations are, and push that out publicly in a time of calm so that the public knows exactly what the commitment is. And if, you can do community engagement around that and see how you can negotiate what that commitment is, that's even better.
Thank you.
Commissioner Ford?
Yeah, I just wanted to touch on something that you said, want to figure out where PPD stands on this. So if the criminal is first, the administrative is second, but in that, 3 to 4 weeks that Deputy Moody talked about, that they're finished with their criminal investigation, if they find something where they know the officer has done something against protocols, do they have a policy in place to have reprimands or have additional training for that officer, so that officer is not on the street for another year and knowing that something wasn't done correctly and more training is needed?
Yes. So the criminal side of the house, but keep in mind too that our training unit does go out to these officer-involved shootings and they do a walkthrough of the scene and they look at what happened. But if during the criminal investigation, a statement is made by one of the officers that is definitely out of policy or not procedural, they will make notification to command staff, and we can and will at that time place that officer off.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Moving on to the recommendations that are clearly not completed. In both the Barnes and McDade OIR reviews, the recommendation was made that officers not be shown video before they give their first statement. And and then once they give that, what I would call perceptual statement, what did you experience? What did you see? What do you know? Then the interviewers can test them with video evidence, not to find discrepancies or to tell them that they're lying, but to test their memory against what the video evidence shows. And this is part of cognitive interviewing, and there are good policies that can lead to that approach to interviewing. Currently it is very clear that under policy, and I believe under the agreement with the Pasadena Union, that any officer involved in an incident may be permitted to review available mobile audio, video, body-worn camera, other video or audio recordings prior to providing a recorded statement or completing reports. So, it's clear that in Pasadena, they can watch it. Now, again, this brings us back to the nuance of which investigation are we talking about. We're talking about the criminal investigation. They don't have to give a statement, and they can, they take the fifth, and you do not compel them until you do your criminal investigation. There's also the transparency interest that overlays that, where as I was saying, there's an interest in getting that video out as quickly as possible to the community so the community can see it and weigh in on it and understand it. So you have this very clear tension between if you're not going to be able to interview your officer for at least that first, 3 to 4 weeks that the deputy chief was talking about, that's still the timeline you pretty much want to get your video out. I understand it's 45 days in California. So the officer is going to see it in that context. So this would require concurrent investigations to have any real force and effect, as I see it, as you balance the interests. And I'll pause there.
I will add that, I'm sorry, did I? Go ahead, Commissioner.
Well, the question may be directed to you. Has the department set forth a rationale for why it waits rather than do concurrent investigations that we can look at?
And like I stated before, one of the rationale, there's more than just the one, but one is we get a completed criminal investigation before we do our admin. So we have all the officers' statements about what they did, why they did whatever they did. So we can review those before we do the admin. So we see what they say, why they shot, what they were feeling, what they were going through, and then we take it and compare that to policy. So we want all those statements beforehand, right? We don't want to, and then we don't want them to change their statements at all. So we want something documented to say, this is what I was feeling. So we can compare if we ask them the same question during the administrative review. Going back to one of the reasons we didn't accept this recommendation was, like Mr. Maxey said, police are human too. So for them to say that we should walk them through the scene and then conduct the interview is not really reasonable. This is a stressful situation for an officer to be involved in a shooting. Then to walk them back through that same scene and ask them why they did what they did, what were you doing here, what were you doing there? It was just too traumatizing. So that's why we don't do that. We didn't choose to take that recommendation. We give the officers the time to settle themselves. After an officer involved shooting, we bring them back to the station. We allow them to decompress. They can call in clergy, family, or a rep from the POA or their lawyer, just like you would someone who's arrested. You allow them to make phone calls, you allow them to settle themselves. And so that's what we do too with our officers. So we didn't accept this recommendation. It's just not a good practice to walk someone through a traumatic event and have them tell you about it, give you a statement on it. I
would like to see a written rationale for why, at least generally speaking, the administrative investigation does not start or does not follow through until the criminal investigation is over. Now, other departments, I believe, do run concurrent investigations, and we may need to look at what is reasonable given all these considerations that the city personnel administration investigation could go forward. I think you or IPA MAXEY indicated that in some circumstances where there's a clear personnel investigation, the officer is, I didn't quite hear the word, but at least suspended. Yes. Where it's clear from the criminal investigation that they have already committed a substantial administrative offense. Yes. But I would like to, for myself, I'd like to see the policy written, if it hasn't been written out, to be written out so we can look at it and compare with other rationales that are out there.
Yeah, so it may not be in terms of a policy, it's just our operating procedures, best practice for us, but we can work with the city attorney to draft something for the commission of our rationale for that.
Thank you. Okay.
Commissioner Jones?
Just one quick thing in regards to re-traumatizing the officers in these stressful incidents, Deputy Chief. Please consider the fact community members have been traumatized and terrorized by the events that occurred within where they live. The incident with J.R. Thomas, his family was present, his neighbors were present. Nobody's concerned about that. We got to do more than protect the police officers and their traumas. We got to do the same for the community. It doesn't show that we're interested in both sides. And I do understand that the wellness unit is now moving forward, working with community. As I told Sergeant Scott Jackson in her presentation while we were at the heliport, I'm really appreciative of that. I absolutely love that. But I just have to say that almost felt like a smack in the face for you to say we're not going to re-traumatize them.
Well, if I may add, if there are witnesses involved in a critical incident in the field, we don't force them to give us a statement at the time. If they're saying, let me call you back, let me talk to you at the station, or I can make a phone call, we don't force a statement from anyone at a critical incident or on a scene if they're witnesses. So you're right, we don't want to re-traumatize the community, just like we don't want to re-traumatize the officers. So I apologize if it sounded like I was just being one-sided on that, because that's not my intention. I don't want to traumatize any of the affected parties.
Thank you, Cheryl. I appreciate that.
You're welcome.
Okay, continuing with the not completed recommendations, and I think I only have one more slide after this, if I recall correctly. In one of the recommendations coming out of the Thomas investigation was that during the Force Review Board, they should have a member or members assigned to red team the incident regardless of the board's opinion. In other words, it's an individual that is designated to explore alternatives and challenge the organization to make it better. It's really just the cross-examiner or the person that is taking the advocacy approach against the department in this review. The department's response, and this comes right from the slide that they presented to the Public Safety Committee, is that the red team approach is intended to provide an aggressive counterpoint in discussions. While the approach can be of value in certain settings, the department believes that the better approach on a review board is to engage all members of the board in critical thinking and robust dialogue, rather than to assign one or two individuals to simply provide counterpoints. That response is, that accords with what I would consider best practice, is that the entire board is engaging in critical review. However, I have not been present at one of those review boards yet to see whether the hard questions are being asked. So, this recommendation to ensure there be a so-called naysayer or a red team member in these interviews is to ensure that the hard questions are asked. And, from my perspective, I know I will be invited to these boards in the future, and I'll be very interested to see how they go out, and, whether the recommendation or the department's response to it is in practice the correct one. Seeing no hands. Oh, I lied. I have two more slides. Pointing of firearms. The PPD should document when officers point their firearms at individuals. As noted in there's a long recommendation here, but basically it's when you point your firearm at a person, which does implicate the Fourth Amendment, because it is considered a use of force in the courts, that you should be documenting when you point the firearms. this leads into a consideration of what the department calls categorical uses of force. And I did have a conversation with the deputy chief in which I was really looking for that definition. What is a categorical use of force? And I searched the policy manual, and there isn't one. There's a reportable use of force that talks about what they will report on, which is usually, if I recall correctly, it's strikes, taser, less lethal, and firearm use. But it certainly does not include the full spectrum of possible Fourth Amendment reporting on things that are a use of force. There are many departments out there that put their force reporting at anything beyond unresisted handcuffing. So if someone just complies with you and you put them in handcuffs, that's not a use of force, simply a restraint. But if you have to, pull their arms together, push them up against the wall in order to do that, do a soft takedown, any of these things that are considered those so-called lower level uses of force, many departments do reporting on that, although it's often cursory reporting. Typically, departments that engage in this divide their force into level 1s, 2s, and 3s, with the numbers as they go up getting to more critical uses of force, with officer-involved shootings as a 3. Pointing of firearms is often reviewed at level 1, which means you're simply noting that you did it, so that if it ever becomes an issue, it is you can respond to it and have a record of it. There is a complex issue around this where it often gets conflated with the idea of always recording when an officer pulls a firearm out of a holster, as opposed to active pointing of the firearm. And as I've worked with departments, I have strongly recommended that you should not have require officers to write down every time they draw their firearm, but that many do want to do it with pointing of firearms. This is a choice the department makes as to what levels of force they want to report out on and what levels of resources they want to put into the reporting and review and investigation of those incidents. But currently, pointing of firearms is not a reportable use of force. I'll pause there. Oops.
Oh.
Vice Chair Serrano.
Thank you. Brian, I'd love to know your thoughts about why it's not a good practice to document when the firearm is taken out of its holster. I just know how oftentimes that can be a tactic or a strategy for intimidation that seems noteworthy in terms of, improving our police community relations. And we wouldn't want officers, engaging in a practice of doing that unnecessarily. And so just would love to know your thoughts more on why that's not worth noting, or you wouldn't recommend that worth noting.
So it's in the context of use of force reporting that I think that really gets complex, because pulling a firearm out of a holster is not a use of force under the law, which is why I see the threshold pointing of a firearm as sort of the first entry into Fourth Amendment implication and therefore reportable force. What gets complex is holding a firearm in the low ready, where you very possibly could point it at somebody's feet. And is that a pointing of a firearm, or are we talking about pointing it at their body or head or something like center mass? It can get pretty nuanced. What I have found with the drawing of a firearm, unless it is something that is just automated, and there are systems that do that. When you pull your firearm, it turns on or alerts your body camera, and you can track it that way. Is that officers? It's hard to know where to put it. You can put it into a report. You can try to make it a use of force reporting, but it's not actually a use of force. There's also, and officers will tell you that it discourages them from taking steps that they may believe are necessary for their safety. I realize there are two sides to that perception, that, as you said, if you pull out a firearm, it is frightening to everyone around you and has an impact on them. And, if someone is using that as a intimidation technique, if they were documenting it, then you would have some evidence of that. So I'm not saying it's not a practice that I would ever endorse. It's just when I look at what officers are writing down and what we want them to focus on and what we want them to record, that just ends up falling pretty low on the list of in my mind, of the really high priority things we do want them putting out there. I'm not saying don't go there. I'm just saying it is, if I were to triage what work we want the officers to do, it kind of falls to the bottom of my list. Does that help?
Yes, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Commissioner Abernathy?
Thank you, Chair Baez. I do appreciate the way you're describing that, Mr. Maxey. I do also want to reference that my past experience with the police department under it was before Pasadena Police Department, was that I was surprised that it was very rare that an officer even drew a weapon. Just drew it, period. Not saying shooting, just drawing the weapon. So we're talking about drawing, we're not necessarily saying pointing at, et cetera, et cetera. Now that was, 20 years ago, 25 years ago. So that the whole, the way the world is different, that may be the way policing is different, that may be playing a role. But when you do link that, it's a step, it's not a use of force, understood, but it can be in response to threat perception. And just like this note here, racial disparities, I just would wonder, just a question, whether the pulling of a weapon happens in certain contexts, in certain communities. My organization, one of the things we wanted to know more about is traffic stops, behavior at traffic stops. We know those are, high tense, unpredictable kinds of encounters, unfortunately known too well here in Pasadena, but then nationally, that's also true. So I wonder about, first, I get the tracking and I get that it may be too much, but I do wonder about the threat perception, the relationship between threat perception, drawing of a weapon. Are you familiar with that research and where that stands? And is that a factor generally? I'm not saying for Pasadena Police Department, but just in general.
So I don't know that there's been research done on the link between threat perception and when an officer pulls a firearm. I think most people assume that if they're drawing the firearm, they're perceiving some kind of threat. There are, I've done a lot of reviews in which the standard we reviewed, the pointing of a firearm, and in Baltimore it was actually display of a firearm is the term they use. That the test was whether a reasonable officer would reasonably believe that the situation could evolve into the need to use deadly force. And while that makes a whole lot of sense, it's really hard to analyze after the fact as you're reviewing a case. Like what was the officer perceiving? Now, if they document it very well and tell you their thought process, I perceive this person did X, Y, Z, this caused fear, or I believe there was a risk that, and then again, could it potentially go into a deadly force situation? So these standards get a little bit amorphous, but I've seen different ways of trying to grapple with this issue. But to your first question, I'm not aware of research that has tested this link. But I could look for it if that's interesting.
Okay. Well, there's a chain of events here that I think do need to understand. Threat perception certainly plays a role, and that's racialized. We know that. And then that influences behavior, and then it creates this chain reaction. Again, that's just one way of looking at what unfolds when maybe everybody involved would say we never intended it to develop to this. So, those chain of events, we've got to begin to understand that more and maybe stop interrupting these deadly, frankly, cycles. So that's the spirit out of which I'm not encouraging you active pursuit of that, but if you do see something, of course, I'll look it up myself too, but yeah.
I mean, there are a whole host of implicit bias tests that are looking at reaction time. I think it's the first initial J. Carell studies are very well known. I can't remember his first name. That really, I mean, it's an interesting test worth doing online where they show you faces and imagery and you click as fast as you can. Maybe you've already done it.